We'll
Well,
see.
cool. Well, I thank you for kind of for being willing to go down this route. I mean, I know you're interested in it anyway, but it's very helpful that you were able to kind of read some of that stuff and do that thinking, and then I could just ask you questions.
Yeah, well, because we've talked before and I've wanted to do stuff, and so this was a good push because I knew a bit about it, but not enough. So it was good for me to dive into it and read some of the sources and stuff. And so it's been good for me as well. So I'm glad we can do this.
Okay. Well, cool. Well, then, why don't you just introduce yourself, and then we'll get started.
Yeah, okay. So I'm Craig. Um, I am American. Like we said, I'm living in Singapore right now because my wife's Singaporean, so we're just living here. I've been a Christian my whole life. Grew up in technically a four square, but really non-denominational. Which I actually kind of liked because we didn't talk about any of the denominations at all, which kind of sucked later on, but it was good because I didn't have any um, bias either way, really, except just the inbuilt ones of where I just thought my beliefs were the natural beliefs of every Christian. But I wasn't scared of anything. So, little after college, as it happens, right, you start to explore more and you start to dig more into all these different um, thinkings, and you find out Christianity is a lot less monolithic than you once thought, which only explodes once you go into early church reading, of course. And I don't think for me, I remember you and I have talked, and we have a similar timeline at about the time that we started to become convinced of uh, the Christian necessity of nonviolence. Oh, 2016, 2017, somewhere around there. And I don't know exactly where I came from it. I don't remember like a certain big moment. But the first time I really started to read into Christianity beyond just my church um, was like the Catholic saints and stuff. And so when you read them, they're all monks they are pacifists, right? They live this very cut off life where they're supposed to literally follow the Sermon on the Mount and blah blah blah. They just don't expect anybody else to. But they're also writing to other monks generally. So, but I come from this 21st century egalitarian. We're all this, like there's no different levels of whatever. We're all, in Protestantism, we're all equally. They were writing to me as far as I was concerned. And so I have a feeling that influenced my ideas a lot because they got to talk about these things about grace and forgiveness without, the caveat, like, except, of course, in these situations because they weren't allowed to. And I have a feeling that influenced me. And so it's only been 21, maybe, 5 or 6 years now, probably. But since then, I've dove quite deeply into it, and yeah, and so that's why I hear it, and that's how you and I met. Actually, was I was looking into stuff and I found your website, and then I made the Discord, and then so we started. I invited you there, so we talked there, and so yeah, yeah, and so one of the first things I did, which kind of brings us to this, is I would see people on Reddit post things about like the early church fathers about nonviolence, but it's on Reddit, and they would just post quotes, which later, quite a while after I did this, I found your website. You did this, but you I think you posted like the fuller quote and where it came from and stuff, but I couldn't find that anyway. They would just say Origin said this, and you're like, but did he? Like, like I'm not gonna totally bank on this. By then I was already pretty convinced of Christian pacifism, but you know I wasn't gonna go around parading that. So I got a few books and started reading that, and then I decided to make a little um, blog, just right. It's really nothing unique. I basically just put that on there so that people could find it rather than just scoffing at it, or if they were looking like me. I wished somebody else had it, I guess. Which I guess you did, but now we have two out there. And that was my first. So I would like read a quote from them from what the one that Sider has. Ron Sider has one.
I think it's just
I
the early church on killing or
Yeah,
something like
I
that.
think that's what it is. Something very basic like that. That was one of the ones I got. And he does good and gives a little context and stuff, but he just kind of has the quote. So then I would go back and like read that whole section, or if it was a small enough for read the whole work. And one thing that you'll notice when you read those things is that the early church fathers, at least the ones that we get writings and stuff from, are typically pretty intense. If you've read any of them, it's a little jarring maybe for some of our modern ears, especially in this kind of ecumenical climate. Um, but they were pretty harsh, at times, and pretty intense. But once you sort of get used to that, and you just get used to different culture and different time and different situations and stuff, there's a lot of good stuff in there, and I really I've enjoyed kind of slowly going through them. But most of my reading has been this interest in this. What we'll talk about this today. Um, this seeming well, it's not a seeming change. There's undoubtedly a change around the time of Constantine. There's no real discussion on that. It's just how much, what exactly changed, and whether it was good or bad.
Yeah.
But once Constantine became, Christian, not once he favored Christianity, it's inevitable that there'll be some sort of changes. Yeah.
Well, cool. Yeah, and I also want to add that in all of this, while we were going through this together, I think it was you, or at least you were influential in suggesting the name for the fourth way. So
I was somebody I remember though. I think somebody said third way, and they suggested fourth way, and I was like,
yeah, yeah,
I remember like, but third way is so common. But they said, yeah, but then there's also the freeze.
yeah,
And I was like, oh, that's so true because we can talk about it all the time, but then there's the following through aspect and stuff. I thought it was really, yeah. So it
yeah.
was not me though, but yeah, but it
Okay.
was part of the
Well, it was
conversation.
your Discord group. Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you said, and we won't be able to get to talk about this, but talking about the monks, it's so fascinating to me that like you get Aquinas and all these just war theory people who, even though they're for killing, they're like, well, yeah, but priests can't do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's amazing when you start looking back through history, which I guess I would ask before we really dig in, like, who cares what happened 2,000 years ago in regard to church history? I'm a Protestant. I've got my Bible right here. I just go to the source, like what Jesus said. Um, why do I care what the early church said, especially when, even if I can pull out some good nuggets, like you said, they're pretty harsh, and they say some things that we would deem crazy about. They had weird ideas about sex, and you should only have sex to procreate, and there's a lot of abstention in marriage, and like there's some weird things that they did. Why do I care about what the early church did?
Um, I maybe think into two different aspects. One, and I think I first heard it from John Bear. He's an Orthodox priest, I believe, and he talks about all the different the. Okay, sometimes I don't think it's fair when Catholic and Orthodox will say that if you're rejecting the early church, you're rejecting the people who wrote the Bible or whatever. Because it's like, well, no, they didn't write the Bible. However, the people who deemed that this, out of all the other writings, were good, the people who fought against other people who tried to get rid of that, like you said, the Protestant with your Bible, well, other people didn't want those certain books in or, whatever. And things like such as the Trinity. And you say, I can find it in the Bible, but it's not necessarily super apparent. So it's like this process of finding these things. Now, when I read through the early church fathers, I disagree with them all over the place. I'm still firmly Protestant, but it's almost like rejecting the means and how we got it. It's like, thank you for all that, and I'm just going to completely ignore any of the process or how we got there. We don't have to follow them everywhere and stuff, but I think we should be respectful, not just as a polite respectful, but I mean, whether we know it, we're influenced by them, I guess is what I'm saying. So it's good to see where we're influenced, how we're influenced. There are certainly beliefs that we have that there are probably beliefs that we have, even if we think we're super sola scriptura, that are largely because of them that we don't even realize. And so it's good to read, and even if you don't change any of your views or whatever, they can help you solidify some of those views. And sometimes you might look at things and go, oh, maybe they know something too. Okay, and here's one more thing before I get to the second point. Whenever I will talk about the early church, so like when I, for example, on Reddit, when I finished my little series on the early Church on violence, and I submitted it. Um, different comments, several of the comments. Well, what do I care about? They're not fallible. They're not infallible. Blah blah blah. And there's just this immediate rejection. If I would have said like C.S. Lewis's view on violence, like, oh, I want to hear that. But for some reason, they think that if I talk about some guy that was 200 years after Christ, I'm like worshiping him as the same. It's like, right, but he's a Christian too. You listen to other Christians. Can't we also listen to them? And I think in some ways we have a better perspective of them. We have more time to have thought about it. We have, as far away as we are, we get all these different, it's the age of information, right? And we have all these different pieces and threads and stuff that they would have been harder for them. Um, but also, they were closer, and they were in a culture closer to it, and they had that stuff too. So it's also smart for us to go back and listen to them. Oh, I got distracted. So I would say that's part of it. Oh, and the other thing is, and some things that I think we'll talk about some, is some of the things that I've seen. So if someone were to ask that who is convinced of nonviolence, for example, or just doesn't like some of the things that's happened in church history, I've seen some of those roots. It's not just like we had this nice, quiet, Amish. Everybody was quiet and humble church, and then Constantine converted, and then we're like committing crusades and stuff. Right? There's stuff that started before it went after. These little streams came, and some of the things I do think perhaps were more or less inevitable to turn into what it did. But a lot of the things I think were fairly innocent. Um, there was a strong strain of pacifism throughout the church. We don't have any writing from any Christian that says anything otherwise. They only say a Christian can't commit, or at least can't kill. But sometimes I think the way they approach it made it easy for next generations to, I won't say exploit, because I don't know that it was done on purpose, but to take that and interpret it maybe in a different way. That perhaps they're like, huh, we wouldn't have thought that. And so if we go and look at that, we can then look at ourselves and go, okay, especially us as pacifists, go, okay, um, but are we setting up and while our communities 100 years later or 200, 300 years later, look at our teachings and our mindset and then be able to, adapt them in a way that we didn't expect once some big change happens? And so that's another thing I think we can look at and see some of the similarities and the things that we don't like to happen in the church. And you talk to a Catholic and there are things that they go, yep, you know, shouldn't have done that. You're right. A fault there. The church isn't perfect. Everybody's willing to see that. Sometimes, as any historian um, or any history, we can look back and see maybe some of the same things that maybe don't look like they're going to turn there, but could. So I think that's one thing that I've gotten a lot from it.
Yeah, as maybe an example of that, I know that the Anabaptists in particular, since they're very big on forgiveness and nonviolence, like when it comes to sexual assaults in the church, there's a lot of, oh well, he repented. Let's just kind of brush this under the rug, and it's kind of used to avoid conflict in a sense, and so their nonviolence can actually be very problematic in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, exactly.
so yeah, and I would add to that for me, I think what blew me away. So the early aspect is really important, like you pointed out, because I think if you're a disciple or a disciple of a disciple, you're probably more apt to get it right. But the other thing was the univocality, because you can find some weird things from like this guy or that guy or maybe a couple guys, but there's just it's just univocal about nonviolence and everything you get prior to Constantine. So that was what was powerful to me, because I didn't expect to find anything on on the topic really. Um,
What What's interesting about that is I I was almost I felt the same thing, but then as I went to look, I was almost the opposite surprised because then I expected lots of works on it. But the only like straight up like work against violence that I know is Tertullian's The Crown or whatever, Crown or something. And I think though, and I was like, what? Then why don't they write extensively on this? I think it was just assumed. Like, why do they have to write this big tract on this thing? Like, just like, of course we don't do. Why would I have to write about a huge thing about not sexually assaulting something? Obviously, you know it. Maybe you'll throw it in. So I think that's actually, sometimes it gets thrown as a criticism, but I think it's actually kind of points to why would they need to? It was known that.
Yeah, and I think that that's that univocality and the assumption of it is important because I think sometimes what's levied is, you know, like with the Bible, well, you just pick and choose. Like, you know, Jesus said not to hurt your enemies, but he also said to gouge out your eye. Like, why do you pick this to keep and choose this other thing not to? And I think you can levy the same thing about the early church. Well, why don't you take their view of sexuality, but you take their view of nonviolence? Well, it's because they're univocal on the
Yeah.
nonviolence.
As far as I know, pretty much all the, heretics or whatever would be too. Which almost seems a push against if you want to go for orthodoxy, but it's like it doesn't even matter. Even where it would go something where the arc of all heretics would still go towards that, and it's just like like who are we to say every single person when they come up with the most orthodox and the least orthodox are against it? But everybody got wrong. Every single person that we know of got it completely wrong. It's just, yeah. I think it's interesting that I can, pull in like these other guys that I would like be really scared to ever quote in, but even they did. That's how strong the that constant strain is.
That's awesome. Yeah, I didn't even think about that or
I
realize
think
that.
most people are scared to maybe mention some of those people, but
Yeah. Okay, well, we better. That was kind of a long introduction, but good. I think important, you know, because why do we care about what happened? So that's important. Um, so I want you to talk a little bit about the birth of Christendom, and you alluded to, you know, this change that happened at Constantine, or changes ish.
hmm
Um, how would you describe the Antenicene Church and then the Post-Constantinian Church? Like, what are some of the big differences that you see? If and I know that these are going to be broad generalizations, um,
hmm
but go ahead.
real fast, did my screen disappear or anything? My camera's still going, right?
No, yeah, I can see you.
Okay, I'm changing spaces. I have some notes, so I just want to make sure as I
Okay.
swap over to the notes that I don't disappear.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah. So some of the things that changed here. Let me see if I can find my thing. Um, well, okay. So of course, on the broad scale, eventually, they call for. It's not so much that the Christians themselves are going into war or whatever. Um, but they start calling on support. So, like when we talk about Augustine, which obviously we will, sometimes you get the idea that like he was going in there calling arms, and it was like his followers going in there. The big controversy was he wasn't. He didn't want to sully his hands, but they would call on the government to do it. So we get this idea, and we see it even in the New Testament that the government is for justice and these different sort of things, and in the New Testament we see some sort of I would believe we see some sort of it's them, right? They're the pagan government. But now once we get they're on our side, um well, we're for justice too, and you're for justice, but now you're with us, so now you're on our side. And it's not immediate because that isn't how they thought it, but that's one way that they were able to sort of justify what they did. So one of the things is they start to call now later on, um and let's see. I mean, we already had some Christians in the army and stuff, and what we see. I think you had a podcast on this, right? With the what are they called? The different uh,
yeah, yeah.
what's the specific the church orders and stuff. We see the church orders becoming. You can't be a soldier at all. Well, you can, but you can't. Well, okay, but you can't join it. Well, okay, and so we get that more and stuff. So that is happening, but there's still not like a wholesale. Let's go up. We're not getting crusades or anything. Um, but as time goes on, we do. But right afterwards, or at least a generation or so, we start calling on them to help us. And so with the Donatist controversy is this big rivalry that started in about 300, but didn't really become a problem until about 347, 350, and then really kind of accumulated around 400. Constantine had tried to deal with it, kind of gave up, and then it became a really big issue. It was the Donatists were actually the main church in North Africa. So they were actually the majority where this was happening. This is where Augustine is. So he fought really hard, and finally he just kind of gave up and was like, "All right, you get them right." And so that was really that's seen as such a pivotal moment. And again, it's not controversial that it is pivotal. It just whether or not we think it's good or not. And that was one of the biggest things was that we can, even if we're not doing it, we can use the government behind us, which then eventually goes to, and hey, why can't we also do it? Yeah, there are also some interesting smaller things, like if you see, um, I can't think of his name right now, but he was another North African bishop of Carthage. Can't think of his name right now, but he
Origin?
no, a little bit later, he was after
Okay.
Tertullian. You would know him; he did a lot of nonviolent stuff too. Cyprian,
Okay.
Cyprus,
Cyprian?
Cyprian, something like that.
Okay.
CY. Anyway, he converted later, and I believe he was richer or something. And he's talked about some of the difficulties becoming a Christian. And I think, if I remember correctly, he kind of liked it. It drew them to the Christian church, but it was also hard. But it was like the fancy dress and the opulence and stuff. But the Christians didn't have that. And shortly after Constantine, a generation or two maybe, they were, the clergy were decked in all this stuff. So much so that I think in the late 4th century, there was a movement against that sort of thing. So it's big enough to where some people wanted to push against it, which seems sort of small to us, but that would have been pretty big to them. We were just these humble people. They were kind of the back. I mean, they were more educated at times, but they were still kind of known for being kind of dirty and stuff. And now they look just like the rest of the rich upper class sort of thing. Um, I think there are a lot of implications there that we could go into, yeah. But obviously, the biggest thing comes down to that marriage between the two, and using the church, which eventually becomes kind of joining with them, or sorry, using the government.
Yeah, it was fascinating to me when I discovered, because I think I think I'm kind of landing more in the middle now, because I've heard some people, especially more towards the nonviolent side, who want to villainize Constantine, maybe for good reasons at times, but just act as if like, ooh, all of a sudden, he just did everything to the church. Um, and what's interesting is, like, when you look at Augustine, you're exactly right. Like, he legitimized the state to do violence. But I remember when I discovered that, well, he was against personal violence. Like, he's not for self-defense. And that, in my mind, doesn't make sense, because as an American Christian, the two are tied together. Like, my government protects my freedom to kill other people if they come after me. Like, it's one and the same thing: the government and my rights, and all that. So that was fascinating. And then, like, other things, like at the Council of Nicaea, Canon 12, I think it is, which says, "Don't go return to the army." You're like, oh, that's actually after Constantine.
Hmm.
Or, I don't remember exactly when the Synod of Arles was, but it was in the 300s. And it said, hey, look, during times of peace, Christians, you need to maintain your commitment to the army. But during times of war, you can leave, because then you'd
Hmm.
have to kill people. And so it's like, okay, you do have these remnants that show, like, it's not Constantine didn't just come in and like make all these changes, that the church capitulated. And maybe that's something that you could speak to. Um, how rapid was the change? Like, what do you see the process as? Because we're here saying that nonviolence was, the early church was univocal, but then Constantine came in and changed it, and it doesn't seem like somebody could come in and just snap their fingers and change something that's so ingrained into the Christian core. So, like, were there seeds of violence in the church prior to Constantine that he kind of exploited? Or, like, what does that process look like?
Yeah. Another interesting thing, yeah, because when you go to the more nonviolent side, they villainize him to a pretty big degree, and there is a lot to go, yeah, in favor of that. But also, it's interesting. I don't know that I never noticed till how you're talking, but that's how we think about it. I don't know that I don't think he was really trying to do anything. When we get to Augustine, he was fully, he knows church and church history. He knows what he's doing and the changes. He knows he's making a change. Um, he says, there's strange before him. But Constantine was just running his empire, man. He just, he wanted unity and he liked this and he thought the sun god, which he later finds out to be the Christian god, this, whatever. I don't even know if he knew that they didn't like different things, right? Like the army and whatnot. I don't know that, from what I understand, I don't even think he tried to. It was just sort of the natural thing. So in some ways, it's like it's really the church people that were doing it, I suppose. Um, but no, obviously he had an influence, and maybe he has more than I thought. But it starts before Yoder. Howard Yoder has what he called the creeping empire loyalty. Sort of maybe the empire isn't so bad after all. We get into Pax Romana, and most of the Christians. There's some skirmishes outside, but there's no huge wars, and most of the Christians are inside anyway. So, you got your presence there, but it's kind of nice. It is safe. It is nice to know that some, countries from the other side aren't going to come in and wipe you out and stuff. So you start to go, oh, okay. We also have this idea sometimes that Christians were super heavily persecuted from day one all the way to him, and they weren't. They weren't highly favored, and there were a few um, eras of heavy persecution. But a lot of the time, like, I don't believe Origen was during any sort of a thing. So, there are probably some things he could have gotten in trouble on, but for the most part, you keep your head down, you can go and you go, it's nice. Another sort of change with that is the world starts to become the cultural world, Caesar's world. And then the barbarians and all these other people out there, we don't pray for them as much. We even have some Christians out there, but we're not as concerned about them because we get so into this. So, and we see this even with Origen, who um, didn't think Christian could do violence. Um, Occasionally, people will try to talk against him and say, "Yeah, but he said, like the emperor or whatever." And so, but he goes, if the emperor and everybody became Christian, he didn't say, then we would use the sword for righteous things. He would just, of course, we'd still be nonviolent. Everybody would just be converted. But you see kind of a positivity of like, he's not super anti. So we sort of get these creeping loyalties and like, yes, we pray for your victories because we don't want those barbarians coming in and destroying our peace. So it's just these little ideas where you can see it's not that hard to flop when you get that. So that's one of the things that I see. We also see there's a strain of optimism within that. So like I said, with Origin and stuff, Eusebius, who um, was kind of like the church, historian, I guess. And he did later work with Constantine and stuff. But even before that, he talked about, let's see, he explained that the Roman Empire, as part of God's design, was part of God's design and envisioned a church ever expanding and happy ending. It was rudely postponed by Diocletian in this persecution, but now it can be continued with Constantine. But we see that this idea before is like, oh, maybe we can live with them. And so that, if that wasn't there, I don't think it ever really would have been able to be possible. Um, and so there's that. Another thing, and we see some things about I don't know how to say his name, Lactantius, another later Christian who was pretty vehemently against war and earlier at least. And he said that all different violence and stuff is because of uh, paganism and like polytheism and worshiping the wrong god. Well, it doesn't take too far to go to that and say, so know how we stop this? We get rid of them, right? Stuff like that. And this is one thing that I think it's big. This is, I haven't seen specifically talked about, but it's something that's always bothered me. So Lactantius, and I think Eusebius did this too, is they would write sometimes pretty gruesome things of different people who had persecuted the church and the untimely fate that they met. See what happens when you persecute us? We didn't do it, but see? And I see this a lot in Tertullian and these other people, um, where they talk about love of enemy, but I locate their pacifism and refusal to be nonviolent. I mean, in copying Jesus and stuff, but like kind of the reason for that, rather than just imitation, is um, God will have revenge, which is very, very biblical, but that becomes kind of the center point. And so it's like, yes, I know you're suffering now. Don't you worry, though, they're going to get it. And not just like a sort of they'll get it eventually, but like we revel in that fact, sort of a thing. That's the kind of feeling that I get. So once we go, and Christians are now favored, they now have one, the power to do this, whereas before it's maybe, people say this about Paul, who don't favor the nonviolence position. They say, well, he only did the nonviolence position so that, they don't get wiped out. Well, I don't think that's true. There is a practicality to that, and now they have the power to wipe them out. And it's like, well, and now you can say, and we don't just have the power because we're allowed to, but the emperor is Christian. Now we are God's vengeance. So that's not what Tertullian meant, but it's not too far to skip there. So I think that was also a strain. Whereas had the root been the love of enemy, which is where I mainly place it, you can't make that jump. I don't know. Maybe you can. We'll
No,
we'll
that
see.
that
We'll
that
see in 2 years when somebody listens to this and takes my words and justifies something. But when you love enemy, it doesn't matter if you have the power to. It doesn't matter if God is ordaining your government. You still love them. You can't do it. And he talks about that, but I think that kind of misplaced, possibly because of the persecution that they endured that I did not. Um, that's nice to know that there's that justice where I don't really. I guess I'm understanding where that came from, but I think that was a big part that made it easy to, especially for the masses. Maybe not for the church leaders, for the masses are like, yeah, sure, right, yeah, okay, now we can finally do what we've kind of been wanting to do.
Yeah, that's very helpful because I think that makes a ton of sense. Now that you mention it, it's like, oh well, yeah, duh. That just because they didn't kill people and advocated not killing people doesn't mean that they had a heart that had the positive ethic of loving enemy. So that's good. Um, yeah, and the another thing that you said in there was, I think, very explanatory for me. In that, when I was reading Salvian's on the government of God, um, he was talking about how like godly the barbarians were compared to the Romans, and you discover that well, there are actually quite a lot of barbarians who are Christians, like consider
Yeah.
themselves Christians, and so this, yeah, the it's like before empire was joined with Christianity, like the borders of Christianity were endless. Like there was no us and them in some border. It was Christians of the world, the Catholic Church. But all of a sudden, when you marry empire, now you have a border, and there's an us and there's a them. And so there, I mean, Christians are killing Christians, barbarians and Romans early on.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and we see that, like I said, you can see that a little bit in Origen, who was before that. However, in Origen, you still see but they'd be converted too, right? He can still, as far as I can see, he still would like the barbarian. They're still capable of it. They're not barbarians, how we think of the term of like brutish and incapable. But once you solidify that and you become married to the church or the state, you, they're now the barbarians forever, sort of thing. You're right. Hmm.
Okay, so can you, because we haven't talked specifically about the Donatist controversy yet, and I think
Yeah.
that's going to be an important focal point. Can you kind of set up the controversy, like how long after Constantine, what got it started, and how was it treated by the church?
Okay. So it actually starts in about. Okay, so the in 301, 303, I think, yeah, 303 to 311 or so, little bit longer for some. There's the Great Persecution. So this is pre-Constantine. And, excuse me, other persecutions seem to be less directed at Christians, more just, make sure you follow the cult of the emperor or whatever it is. This one was more directed towards Christians, and there was a threat of 4 edicts called church buildings could be destroyed, sacred writings burned, Christians could lose their civil rights, and clergy could be imprisoned and stuff if they didn't sacrifice and do this. And later even could be killed if they didn't do that. So you get some people who refuse to sacrifice and stuff. You get some people who give in, and you get some people who would forge a paper saying that you did, but you didn't actually give in anything. So afterwards, there's a lot of controversy to what to do with the people who have lapsed, right? Because then a lot of them are like, okay, oops, sorry, I went back in now. And there's huge controversy. So that's actually where it starts. So the Donatists are on the more extreme side of either don't let them back in, or I don't know exactly what their point of view is. I know some would. They can, offer, they'll never ever be able to partake of the sacraments again, but they can kind of be part of our church, and as long as they're all offer penance every day or every week or whatever, when they die, they'll be accepted kind of in the church. I don't know exactly what the Donatists were, but there were several groups that did this. But the Donatists are somewhat remarkable because they became so widespread. The others were small. It's not a big deal. Like I said, the majority in North Africa. So in about, let's see, there's this in 347. So Constantine actually, so before 347, I'm sorry, Constantine tried to work with them a little bit, and their big thing. I'm sorry, I missed a part. So the reason why this comes in with the Catholic Church is then the Donatists said, okay, but like I forgot the names, but like Felix or something was a lapsee. He lapsed, and then he baptized this guy or whatever. Now he's your bishop, and your bishop is illegitimate because he was baptized by this guy, or this guy who was baptized by this guy. So it's all legitimate all the way down. And so that's why the Catholics would get really frustrated, because they were a little bit difficult, if you might say. So Constantine was trying to resolve this, and he kind of gave up. But he had a trial to see if they could figure out if they had forged documents, and they got 2 in the end. They got 3 trials, and all trials went against the Donatists. So by this point, they look like extremists, and everybody's pointing. Of course, in Africa, they don't think so. They think that that it was rigged or whatever it was. So that's kind of where it starts. In 347. Constans, not Constantine, the next emperor, Constans, was had a big campaign, I guess, where he was giving out money to the poor throughout, giving alms to the poor, which would include the Donatists, and of course, part of it was to give to the poor, part of it was to butter them up and stuff and get them part of it. And one of the guys, Macarius, he presided over the mass, and for the Eucharist, he put up imperial images on the thing. So when they would go up to worship, they would be bowing to these. And we don't know that he did it on purpose or he was just ignorant and it was a really bad PR move. But the Donatist, the man, was obviously very against that. Like, see, they're trying to get us to do this and whatever. And so they rebelled against that. And so then we get this huge thing. And he did. This is all very difficult to tell what happened, but to be fair, to be neutral, he called on these people called the Circumcellions, who we know lots about them and nothing about them. But they were sort of freedom fighters, as far as I can tell. And I don't know that they were really attached to the Donatist church, except he kind of called on them to keep them away so that they don't defile our places. And then they get associated with the Donatists for being violent and stuff. But this is important because what happens is, so Donatism becomes, they ban it or whatever, and Donatus and a few others of the leaders get banished, and they refuse to go, and so what happens is they silently get killed, pushed over a cliff. Donatus and I think Maximus or something, one other guy.
Wait. So that's literal. That's not figurative.
So literal, yeah.
Okay.
Now Augustine, didn't he didn't believe that it actually happened. And we're like, who knows? But he goes, because they have all that's not how Rome executes people. They would do a legitimate way. But the whole point was that it was illegitimate. Right? The whole point is they couldn't just go doing it, so they do it in the dead of night, and they quietly push them over the end and kill them. And one of the reasons to do that is to avoid martyrs. Um, and it got found out, so now they're the biggest martyrs, and now this church is the church of the martyrs. They already kind of were before, because they had that stance of during persecution, and now that's what they're about. And this is when it really starts to get fired up. And they start to get attacked so I've already kind of mentioned their attacks on Catholicism, the Catholic side of things. And then the Catholics would attack them for, of course, divisers of unity. They love controversy. That's all their thing. If they would just join with us, except they love, you know, division and stuff. And for extremists and violence, again, a lot they attach to those circumcilians. And for what they would call suicide. So these guys, a lot of times they were circumcilians, but they would go and supposedly do things to provoke people to kill them to become martyrs. So you go into a pagan temple, destroy the stuff, the pagans would get mad, kill you, you're a martyr, you got exactly what you wanted. We're not it's clearly exaggerated. Some of it may have happened, some of it we think like they were going to get killed anyway, so they do it in a way. So then they start making laws. We're like, but you're not a martyr if you did this first. So if you destroyed some property and get killed because of it, you're not a martyr anymore. So this is where it kind of comes from, and they're trying to go. And so it eventually comes to head in, what is it, 411, I believe, is when it really comes to Augustine finally kind of changes his stance, goes, this is bad and it's affecting other things. If we just persecute them and stuff, they'll stop. And of course, he doesn't say it quite like that. He loves the image of the surgeon, right? I know it's painful. You don't understand, but it's for your own good. And he even talks about things. I know some people, they didn't like it when they went in there and got roughed up and stuff, but now they're so grateful because of that they got to the true faith, sort of thing. So that was his thing. Like, in his defense, Augustine, again, people on our side of the fence often see him as like this bloodthirsty, kill them all. He didn't want them to be killed, and he pleaded and pleaded for them to be less brutal with them. Surely, partially was because then it creates martyrs, and it does opposite the cause. But I'll give him the benefit of the doubt that he didn't really want to go in there and do that, which again, we see this sort of slow progression. Well, I'm still not going to attack anybody, but I can have the government to do it. But it's not quite, starting a war. They are still part of our citizens. We do it. And then we'll go further down. So that's why it's so important, is this really sticky group, and they couldn't get rid of them. And they were very stubborn, a little bit self-righteous, wouldn't go. And you couldn't really do that anywhere else. But they were able to kind of fit the situation for North Africa to where they were able to persecute them without creating the martyrs. And eventually it wins out, and then now we have presidents to use the government for things. Whereas before, even when they were going, both sides were really hesitant. One way that you could attack the other side is saying, you're just using the government to pick on us. Both sides would do that. And at this point, he goes, well, yeah, essentially. And he changed his mind. He says, people wonder why I changed my mind. He's very, again, not controversial. He himself says it. But that's kind of where it comes from, yeah.
Yeah, and that's helpful too. I want there to be more clear-cut answers, like, nope, Constantine was evil, he just came in and changed everything, or Augustine was terrible, he just was bloodthirsty. And I remember reading Leonard Verduin's work, and that was the first place I came in contact with the Donatists. And he and a lot of others in our persuasion, they kind of elevate the Donatists as like, well, they had the true faith and were carrying it along, and they were persecuted. And I was talking to a friend whose focus in his graduate degrees was on Augustine, and he's like, yeah, they were kind of big. Looking for an appropriate word. They were, like you said, self-righteous. They were self-righteous, arrogant. jerks, like the Donatists. A lot of them were. It's not nearly as clear cut there. What I think is clear cut is, all of a sudden they started getting killed by Christians, and that's a
Hmm.
problem. It seems
Yeah.
to me, at least.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. When you look into them, I think another reason why people think that is a lot um, of people that I know. I've heard that too, but they tend to be more on the Anabaptist side, whether or not they're not are not, and they sound like Anabaptists. They baptize again because they didn't accept the Catholic baptism, and they accepted a really high standard for morality, and they didn't like the government and stuff. But it's all those reasons are for radically different reasons than the Anabaptists ever thought. So they're very, very surface level things. Um, mhm.
So you would say, like, if you looked at the church under Augustine and the church, his group, and the Donatists, are they all Christians? Is there one group that's Christian or one group that's more Christian than another, or are they just Christian in different ways? Because I can't imagine going into a mosque and defiling the mosque, which is essentially what the Donatists were doing. That sounds
Yeah.
terrible. So, like, who are the Christians?
Yeah, I'm glad that you specifically mentioned like the mosque thing because I was surprised that I knew by this point it would be more black and white, but I thought that still they pretty much didn't do violence. But they were. I don't know that they hurt people, but the Christians also did. I believe the Catholics did too, and all the bishops on both sides were like, "Stop burning down temples and stuff." But the people are doing it. As to which is a Christian, I not that it's my decision to say anyway, but it's hard to say. I mean, there are things like I think that almost everybody would look at Augustine and say, yeah, because he would get really frustrated with the Donatists, like, well, this guy 2, 3 generations down, he betrayed our church. So everybody that he baptized is now illegitimate. And he's like, well, let's just say you're right. But can't we look at their merits now? And I think most people go like, yeah, that's pretty reasonable, and so we'd go there. But then you also see he's mean. He was really mean in his words, at least, really harsh. And it's interesting because it was him and another guy that is not quite as famous. I forgot his name, but Tatus or something, who are really writing against the Donatists. And it started out more friendly. Oh, they're Christians, maybe what we'd see, maybe a different denomination. But we're still brothers and stuff. They just have these different things. But it's this controversy that made both sides just hate the other side to where they wouldn't consider the other one Christian anymore. And so I don't know. As opposed to which one I would agree with more, I also don't know because we get most of the Donatist side through the Catholic side, which is very obviously not unbiased.
Okay, so a lot of what we know on the
The vast
Donatists might be a
majority.
little bit of propaganda.
The
Okay.
vast majority, right? So like we know that it's probably exaggerated how much the like what they would call suicide runs, the martyrdom runs would be, but we don't know exactly how much or whatever. I do not feel a very strong affinity to the Donatist Church, if I'm totally honest. Um, okay, this is speculative though, and this is maybe sort of getting at the heart of what you're asking though. I don't know which side I would go on. Obviously, I look at it not part of either tradition, and I can go, oh, there's good and bad, and I'm sure they're good people and eats and stuff. But even if we take the Catholic side, I think that their approach, though quicker, did more harm in a few different ways. Um, I can understand why there are so many hurt feelings. I explained that one part where they get pushed off the edge, because like you're not going to be able to convince people that they're all friends if you think that if you're defending these people. Well, go a generation or two, and people start to sort of forget that perhaps. Um, and you wait a little bit, and you sort of let them have their thing, and you don't take the churches, and you don't destroy things, and you don't kill them, and you don't do this, and give it some time, and then they'll be more willing to maybe open up a dialogue. You say the call for unity is just a veil for one of the historians I was reading wrote the absurdity of what the Circumcellians would do of kill me or I'll kill you. Oh, you won't kill? Okay, I'll kill you. I'll go to the next guy until I finally get martyred. What was met with the equally thing of accept our charity or die, sort of thing, right? And so it's sort of a fake thing. But if they didn't have that and just kind of let them go and say, we really want unity, as long as there's disunity, it's on your end, but we won't push it farther. We won't force you until you're ready. I have a feeling within a generation or two, things would be lighter between the two and some discussions would take place. And as far as we know, eventually they could go. I mean, look at Catholics and Protestants, bloody between the two. And a division is always hard. And 500 years later, now we're finally starting to see some people, as hundreds of years of not violently killing each other. Finally, we're starting to see this ecumenical movement being able to have dialogue, being able to discuss. Even if I think they're not true Christians, at least we can talk and go with them. And there are a lot of people saying, you know what, are those even essential differences? And it takes a long time, but it can happen. But as soon as they decided they need to join us now and agree with us now, or they're gone, we've severed any chance of that.
That's a really good point, about the ecumenical movement now after Christianity has had some peace for a while, at least in the West. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I I don't know where I'd land because I agree with you about the Donatist nitpicking about the baptism and the validity of that. Nevertheless, it's always difficult for me to want to side with the group that killed people and burned books. Usually,
Yep.
that's not the right side.
No. If I were to, it's not just me as an amateur. From what I understand, we don't, like I said, Circumcellians are one of the groups that we know so much about. There's so much literature of them in ancient times that we don't really know anything about them. But from what I understand, it's largely thought that they're not really Donatists. They're freedom fighters in some way, and they sided with them because they were the underdogs. I mean, they were the main in North Africa, but they were the ones getting bullied. They were the ones where the overall empire was picking on them. So, there is a point to go with them. Yeah. So I have a lot of sympathy for them, but not specifically with their beliefs. But yeah.
Yeah. So that brings me to another question that I really wrestle with, because when you say, okay, well, after Constantine, Augustine, and all that, you basically you lose the voice of an alternate church. You get a state-sanctioned church. You've got the emperor presiding over councils, and kind of persecuting heretics, or at least applying pressure or incentives to the state-sponsored church. That there's a saying that the winners write history, and when I think about orthodoxy and the Orthodox faith and what that means, and valuing what we've been handed down, I feel like when I get to this point in history, like I can look at the early church and say, well, they were univocal on nonviolence. I can look at that and I feel like that's unadulterated orthodoxy that they're handing to me, or what they believe they're handing to me. When I get to Constantine, I don't know. Like it throws my understanding of orthodoxy into a tizzy, because it's like, is this the faith handed down once for all? Like, what parts of it have been the winners writing history? Because if violence for 1700 years has been orthodoxy, just war theory, and that's very wrong. Like, what else is very wrong? So how do you work through that? Like, not throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, Briefly, we see this some in the Reformation. This is more the radical wing, which would include Anabaptists, and then you get the people who um, anti-Trinitarians, right? So like anti-Trinitarian's an intense word, but like a Unitarian, maybe we'd say now, and stuff like that, because some started to like, hold on, okay, but you're just going back to this point, uh, but even before, and then they completely rewrite it. So that is something to go through, and I don't, I don't have a great answer. It's something I also will probably always wrestle with to some degree, and I guess I'll start with that. Is I think it's good to have that. Because if you're not wrestling with it, you've just settled down and decided you know, and you don't. I think it was N.T. Wright who said, any given point that I'm talking, I'm wrong by 20% of the stuff I'm saying. I just don't know what 20% that is. I would amp that number up a bit for me, but I think it's an appropriate thing to look at, and that doesn't mean we have to hit a whole agnosticism where we can't ever hold on to anything. But I think it's good to always be ready for an uncomfortable change. For example, nonviolence. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I mean, I like the NT Wright quote and stuff. But yeah, for me at this point, I think what it's done is I still hold on to things, but I hold on to them loosely. Like I remember reading Gregory of Nyssa, and so this I think highlights the value for me of going to the early church. And I read some of his stuff on the resurrection of the soul, and I was reading through it, and I was like, I think he's a universalist, but he can't be because he was an Orthodox Christian. And then you just start looking through early church history, and you have annihilationists, you have universalists, and they were all getting along. It's like, or I mean, they were
More
having
or
nice
less.
discussions, yeah.
Yeah.
But they all considered each other Christians. And I think what it's done for me going to the early church is it hasn't overturned my Christianity, but it's really broadened what Christianity means, because it's not just this one denomination within Protestantism that's truly Christian. It's like there are lots of people who are theologically Christians, and I think it's terrible what Protestantism does in its ultra exclusivity, because pretty much we can't accept anybody from the early church by our standards.
Hmm. Yeah. It's interesting because I see that somewhat with Catholics. In some ways, Catholics are more broad, more accepting. But there are different things where they love origin and all these different things, and you go, yeah, but look at all these things that they were wrong with the Christology or whatever. They go, but that's totally unfair. That was Antenicene. That was before they had it. I'm not sure why exactly it would matter. If they're wrong, they're still wrong, right? That comes from my probably more Protestant side. Who cares if it wasn't fair? If they're wrong, they're wrong. But I don't know. I don't know exactly where to go. Like I said, I don't. I like what you said. You hold it, but you hold it loosely. Doesn't mean you can't have anything. But there is, on the one sense, you see, I mean, really early on, five, um, 5 volumes on, against the heretics and stuff. I mean, it's not like they were against each other. They were, pretty harsh at times, but there was a huge openness. You talk about, yeah, like annihilationists, the whatever fertilist traditional view, whatever, and universalist, and they disagreed, but they didn't, as far as I know, ever say, and therefore he's not a Christian. Even Augustine was like, "Oh, those universalists, those sappy sons of guns," but they're not meaning to do anything. They just don't understand Scripture and stuff. But they mean well, and that is something you can't do now at all. And so, the I don't know exactly the answer. I read it and it's challenging and it's good, and I go back, and typically you stay with your beliefs because you have reasons for that. And you've grown up with it and you're just more likely to stay with that. But I'm less condemning of other ones. I realize no matter how much any of us know we're wrong, even if I'm completely correct about everything, I still don't know everything. Like I'm still not all right. At the very best, I'm not wrong about anything, if that makes sense. So, and there's like, at what point then? Because now, especially Protestantism, but I think it's everywhere. There's really an emphasis on like correct belief, sort of thing, over everything else. And it's like, but at what point is it correct enough? Because if we all have certain points, it's incorrect. But I do think that belief is important, so I wouldn't say it doesn't matter at all. But it's hard to know, like, at what point. But I'm much less concerned about that now. There are people who have views, and I probably have some strong ones where Jesus is the centrality. He embodies the Father perfectly. You look at him, you will see the Father right there, and we are to imitate him. And I think as long as we can agree on that, I could probably go pretty well. with most people. I even have discussions with people who have different views on him, on what exactly his divinity was and stuff like that. And it's troubling at times, but I find that for the most part, it doesn't even come up. Because for the most part, we still see the Father through him, and we still think that whatever he said, and so it's like, wow, I don't know if you have to be Trinitarian or whatever, um, but it makes me less quick to just like, well, they're not a real Christian and stuff, and there's more tension in there, but I don't know where I would draw the line. One thing that I find interesting is this missionary, E. Stanley Jones, was very big into the ecumenical movement. He was in India, friends with Gandhi, so that time period. And he was very orthodox. You look at his beliefs, belief-wise, he's very orthodox, but he wanted the unity of the church so bad, so bad. And he wanted, very similar to what I said, as long as we just see Christ as the central and we long to follow him and go in him and he is the central, then all the rest, as incredibly important as it is, we can put that as like kind of a secondary. But we're all brothers and sisters once we do that. We might be very distant at times and stuff, but if that can be it. And he mentions this one thing. He has a really superb book on the Sermon of the Mount, and you can get it online for free. And on there, he's trash talking Constantine, and he goes the like the creeds and stuff are really important. He goes, and I think the creed's important, and I believe in the creeds and stuff, but it's important to note that the nowhere is the Sermon on the Mount in our creeds, and how different would it be had that been put in our creeds? If it said, I believe in, God is this and Jesus is this and blah, blah, and that, we don't do this and he didn't do this and we didn't do this. We couldn't have Constantine. We couldn't have this. We couldn't have this. We couldn't have this, because this sort of behavioral belief system, not as some sort of a rigid law system, but that becomes part of, it's orthopraxy, but we can see it like that's part of orthodoxy as well in terms of just the correctness of it. But we've pretty much just reduced it to this creed. Kind of forgotten that the creed is just a shorthand for what we should really know behind it. It's just like, checklist, yep, you got them all, and it's done. And that means we exclude a lot of other people, and then we include that, like, really, we have to exclude them because of this, but and then we include a lot of people like, we're including them, and I'm not real big on seeing who I should or shouldn't include, but I, I'm stumbling around because I don't have an answer, but I think that it's difficult and that we need to be more open with it, and we can hold firm to our beliefs and never step back from what we believe, while also realizing that at some points we should reevaluate and see where we are wrong at different points, and not be so quick to push somebody as claim somebody as non-Christian. There may be a point where we decide, at this point I can't consider you a Christian, but I think we can be a lot slower to do that than we do now. And when you read the early church, as extreme as they can be, they do that a lot more than you would think. I heard that and I read them. I was like, oh, what are you talking about? They're really into orthodoxy and there's correct beliefs. But then you step back and you go, actually, they weren't so much. They weren't going and trying to totally get rid of them. At times they did, say Marcion or something. But it's much more open than perhaps we know, and just having that humility, I think, goes a long way. And going back to what I said before, I think that opens the chance for everybody, yourself and others, to then come to a more correct view. But if you're just like, oh, wrong belief, you're wrong, you're just distorting scripture, whatever, well, they're never going to listen to you. They're just going to become more entrenched in that beliefs, may become more extreme beliefs there, and then break off and then have their own little group, and then would never be reconciled. So if we
Yeah,
have a
and
bit more openness, we have more likeliness to then come together and have similar beliefs, in fact.
yeah, and the things that they were nitpicky on and were willing to push back more on was tended to be orthopractic from my limited reading of the early church.
Yeah, my from what I see as well. Yeah, not always, but even a lot of times when it wasn't, it tended to have the implication of that, not just like
Yeah,
some random thing. There tends to be some implication of, and therefore that's why you behave like this, or you wouldn't behave like this, sort of a thing.
Yeah, and if you would, if you remember, shoot me a link for that book that you're talking about,
Mhm.
because I'd be interested to read it, and I could put it in the notes.
Yeah, no
Um,
problem.
so I've got two more questions that I want to get to, and then we'll see where we go. But I guess one of the questions that might be helpful, and this would be speculative. So if you just feel like you have no idea how to answer it, that's fine. But I think a comparison would be helpful because you talked about early issues that were addressed by the church. Um, so when we get Constantine, Augustine, Sword, kind of enforcing orthodoxy and disputes, what did disputes look like in the church before this? Like, so that we can compare, because I think, like you said, sometimes people are like, well, what else are we going to do? Like, well, we have to do it this way or whatnot. So seeing kind of a comparison, I think might be helpful to say, okay, I have a vision for what it would look like without sword. And you also talked about it a little bit earlier where you said, um, now that we're in the West without the sword for 70 years ish, uh, we are more ecumenical. So talk about maybe some early examples of how they handled controversy and what that might look like today.
Yeah, I haven't been able to find too much. I find that really interesting too. Maybe other people have not. For what I've seen is they tend to write mean things, right? They write polemical things like, here's several volumes on this and attacking them. So just try to convince people. Or they would just excommunicate them or something. So generally it wouldn't be like a whole church, right? It would be, Arius or somebody, and he'd be a bishop, and then they would. And I don't even know. I've looked it up, and I don't even know because excommunication can mean different things. It can mean you can't partake of the sacraments. You're completely gone forever. You can't go in the church. I think it was more of that for the bigger ones, but they just said, "Okay, nope, you're not part of us," and they just did their own thing. I don't recall anything of them ever like, and then following Arius as he went down. They only got mad if he kept trying to influence their people, but they didn't like, we have to wipe him out from the place. They were concerned about the group, and they would spread out, and then that was important as well. But if he's not part of the group, then he's not part of the group, and it's not a big deal. So when it
So is it
influenced them, they cared, and they just kicked him out, as far as I could tell. And they would debate it and then kick him out.
so it might be as simple as like a First Corinthians 5 thing where this guy's having sex with his stepmom and Paul's like, hey guys, like have no part of him. Like as simple as that.
I believe so. I believe
Okay.
so. Um, However, we look at, say, to go back to the Anabaptists, they did that as well, and they splinter, because like your hair is done the wrong way and stuff, and so they weren't that extreme apparently. But when those big ones came to a head, as far as I can tell, they would write works against it and debate. I don't know how else debates were done, and then eventually, when they would get tired and neither side would give in, they would just say, well, be gone. Don't influence our congregations. Um, which I'm not entirely sure why they didn't just do that with the Donatists to begin with. Maybe it was such a big group that it was harder to do that. Um, Even before he changed, Augustine changed his mind to use the sword. I'm not sure why they didn't just why that wasn't his view, but he really, really wanted to do stuff. Maybe it was just a new option that they had. Um, the way some of them read, I will be honest, I wouldn't be particularly surprised if after a long time they finally just gave up and said, you know what? And then, used resources that they had. But I don't think that was even in their mindset. I think it would have taken a while before they finally got to it. Um, yeah. So as far as I can tell, that's all it was. They would just talk. And if nobody could come to it, then they just say, don't be influenced by them. They're wrong.
That sounds so anticlimactic. Like there's no resolution there. Nobody's killed. The problem isn't ended. It just goes on. Um,
to
but
be to be fair, we do see that where we see these things. People probably say, yeah, and look at how long Arians went by or something. But to be fair, we also see, Donatists and other stuff still linger on even afterwards. the sword isn't as effective as we think.
Yeah. So, and that's a good segue to the last question that I had, which again is speculative. Save the speculative ones for the end. But I think you can probably build a case off of it from what you've researched and talked about today. So, as United States citizens, well, I don't think we can imagine, like, it's difficult for citizens of the United States to imagine what Christianity looks like divorced from sword, because our government's Christian, and and our government, I mean, bears the sword a lot. What what do you see the how has the post-Constantinian church ideology impacted the world today, and specifically the United States? You know, a lot in my group, conservative Christian group, are trying to get their hands on the sword. They want to get their Republican president in, and they want to control the world, and they want to bring religious freedom for Christians, and kind of get atheists out of schools and stuff. So bear the sword against other religions, and enforce our version of morality. And that sounds really good, because I want to live at peace and I want to live in comfort. What do you? So I'm sorry, this is a really ambiguous question. It's more of me ranting. Talk about what impacts the sword has on Christianity in the West as we know it. How that's maybe bad, and what it might look like if we didn't try to wield the sword.
Well, I think it just looks different in terms of, I'm not thinking so much as practical here right now, but the Christianity, like you said, it's this idea of like, yeah, but our morality is the best, so it'd be best if we just hard armed people into it, and then they would be grateful, sort of thing. Like I said, it goes back to Augustine. And it's just such a different. You get the macho Jesus that we've seen in different preachers. What was a number of years ago? Mark Driscoll.
Mark Driscoll,
That he
yeah.
could never worship somebody they could beat in a fight or something ridiculous like that. And he's a little bit of a goofball, but I think that general sentiment of like, yeah. And we get there because the Gospels don't really portray that, except like two scenes in John and, whatever. So maybe twice he, roughed up the in the temple area. But then you have to go to Revelation and like, okay, he was weak and wimpy this time, but that's just because next time he's going to take him down. And so we've turned it into a tough guy religion. You start way all of the Jewish scriptures, and they're just they're just like these. You get Abraham, who's a rich guy, landowner, and then he has to go and wander around, so he kind of loses that. And then you just get a bunch of these like shepherds living. We kind of glorify them now, but they're just like stinky, peasanty, shepherdy types of thing. Not exactly peasant, but they're there's the big empire Egypt, and they're just like the little people on the outside, and then they're slaves for 200 years. 200 years, 400. They're slaves.
400, yeah.
400, yeah. 400 years, and then they're wandering around the desert, and then they have a brief time of like flourishing for like a few kings, and then they're just like, oh, the kings are bad and all this is happening, oh no, Assyria came and took us, oh, Babylon, and all these things. And then we come to the New Testament when they're under occupation of Rome, and then Jesus comes and doesn't break from the occupation of Rome. They're still, and then they become even more attacked than Judaism, because Judaism was respected as an ancient belief. And then when Christianity started to be seen as separate from that, it's like, it's just some new religion. So at no point really, except for maybe briefly in the kingdom period, have the scriptures ever been written from the point of view of those guys in charge pushing out to everybody else. In fact, the prophets are often when the Hebrew kings are in charge, and during their reign attacking them about how terrible they are and how terrible they are for all these persecutions that they're doing. And then Christianity, or American Christianity, it goes far beyond American Christianity, but that's the brand I'm most familiar with. Christendom, really. So now it goes, like, just forgets that entire narrative, and it's like, but now we're on top, and now we can do it. It's like, oh, you put so much in the Bible. The entire narrative of the Bible is the complete opposite view. If it were to be written from there, it would be attacking, that side. And so we just get this total flip-flop. And that's why Jesus' words don't really make any sense to us about the first is last, and this is last, and this is how you'll serve. Not like the Gentiles and stuff, and we just ignore it because we think he needs to be macho and he's just whatever, and we have 1,000 different ways to explain it away. And so that is, I don't know if you're looking more for like the practical things of what we do, but I think our just entire perception of it would be different from this really macho, tough guy. We have the correct morality, and so we need to bully people into it. From this meek, we have the correct morality, and we will maintain that correct morality at all costs. And people may see us and then go with us, but that is how we witness. Is we never go beyond Jesus because he wasn't a king and now we're kings. We're not beyond our master. We stay with him, and that is how he showed his morality, and that's how we'll show ours. But nobody would admit this, but I feel we've gone beyond Christ, who is just this kind of poor preacher who had some good ideas, and now we got the sword, so now we can actually fulfill his ideas in a way that he wished he could have. And that has all sorts of implications there, but I think that is just our whole view of what our religion looks like, and it's not too hard to maybe imagine what would happen after that.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. The last I looked, in the United States, Congress, the last Congress was like high 80% Christian, identify as Christian. And the military is, I don't know, like 60, 70%, something like that. Whatever the numbers are, it's big. Like Christianity and government and sword are, I mean, they just go hand in hand in our world. So, yeah.
So with that reminds me of another reason why Constantine, his transition was maybe not as hard as we might think, is the kings have always been about justice, right? That's their thing. And Christianity is all about justice. Now, they might be different justices and they might look at it different ways, but they both have this view of justice, and so it's kind of easy to go. And so I think that a lot of people see their Christianity for that because they see words like justice and stuff, and then they just assume that that's what it means. So I tell people, who are military and talking really to be offended that I think that they're horrible, disgusting murderers who hate all life and stuff. And I say we actually probably have a lot. And talk about, I bet you want justice and you don't want these bad things to happen. I bet we could talk about a lot of the reasons and agree on most of them. The difference is just, I think your way is I tend to be a little bit nicer and just say it's ineffective and stuff, and also just incorrect, and you think mine is. But I think my idea of justice is a bit different, but there's enough there to where people can use that Christianity in order to support that view. I would say it's probably the opposite, where we have that really strong view, and then we bring Christianity up there. But it has a lot of those words that we can wrap it in there. And I have a feeling that's why so much of that is there. It's such high numbers. Is it can be compatible if you pick a lot of those keywords.
Yeah, that's a great point. That, I mean, somebody in the military, our ends are largely the same. It's the means that are different. And I would add, we add to that the end of reconciling enemy.
Yeah, the destruction of the enemy so that they're not attacking us typically comes down to what people are looking at, which is not the same. But I tend to but you're correct. It is different. Like I said, there is a bit different justice there, but I have a feeling that's why it's easy enough to co-opt into that.
Although, like you said, Augustine even said, hey, I do want my enemy to be saved, but through my harsh means. So I guess, I mean, you could even be in the military and desire that your actions would convert the enemy through force.
Yeah, I mean, colonialism. So luckily we've
Right.
largely gone like, oh, but I've heard people justify it like, yeah, it was really bad. We shouldn't have done it. You're right. However, I mean, it might have been a net good. Sure, their ancestors didn't like it, but I'm sure they're glad that they're Christian now. So you're supposed to sort of distance yourself from colonialism, but there's still this justification. And I have a feeling,
Yeah.
hopefully, in another 102 years, people will look back and like, huh, look at all this stuff, and they'll distance themselves from these different, justice things of going and being the police force and stuff. Though I
Mhm.
have a feeling they'll still go. But I mean, it was for certain, you
Right.
know.
So to kind of wrap this up, is there any question, because of my lack of expertise, that I just didn't think to ask, that you're like, I really wish you would have asked this, or this would have provided some helpful insight into all of this? Is there anything that you're chomping at the bit to bring up?
Not that I can think of. No. I had because I like to be way over prepared. um, well, how about this? Just kind of as an ending note, because this is similar to what we were talking about. Uh, some of the similarities, and it kind of goes to the what's the difference of how Christians responded. Some of the similarities to the of the new Christian Constantinian, the way that he did things, and the old ones. So it's like, so what changed? So you were kind of asking the opposite. So how did Christians change? But it's different. Like, if he really was Christian, surely he would rule differently than the others did. And there were some things like the giving of the alms, and he did build some things. There were some good things too. Also, though, like I talked about the just, there's this idea that I am just. Before, you had to go through a huge process, several years of being a um, of being a
Catechumen?
yeah, catechumen. There we go. Of being a catechumen and stuff. And Constantine didn't really bother with that. He was largely self-taught. For a long time, he didn't even really want to be taught or anything, and he didn't get baptized till the very end. Um, and so it's this kind of a new idea of like, I'm the emperor, and the emperors are obeyed, right? I don't need you to tell me to do these different things. I don't need you to tell me how the world works. I know how it works. I'll listen to different things. Of course, he has advisors and stuff, but he's the one who sort of gets to understand it. We looked at the things that Constantine himself, that he attributed to the Donatists. Like I said, he did deal with them for a bit. He said intransigence, um, obstinacy, deliberate divisiveness, which are the exact same things that the emperors before did to all the other groups, including the Christians. Obviously, the Donatists often would compare themselves to like, see, it's the exact same thing of what used to happen to us because we're still the Christian church and you're just the regular pagan empire.
But it's different when you're right.
Yeah. I talk a lot about the Anabaptists because I know a lot about the history of the Reformation there. And a lot sometimes some of the Anabaptists would like go to the reformers and like, but you changed your religion. You're not Catholic anymore. Yeah, but we're right, and it's hard for us to understand, but that was a perfectly legitimate understanding. Yeah, and the just idea that unity, religious unity and stuff, could be found through force, because they did that with paganism and stuff as well, right? You have to worship these gods, and now it's like, well, okay, same thing. It's just different gods in place and stuff. Um, and so those are all things that we see of that just I think should raise an eyebrow. You expect Christianity to be a bit different. It's in a totally different scenario. Just like you look at any preacher, they don't want to change their church to be exactly like the New Testament church because we're in a completely different scenario, of course. Um, but you got to look at how it changes and look at how much it didn't. The emperor didn't change. The empire, sorry, and how it was run. There were changes, but so much of it was just exactly the same with different words. And I think it should make us step back and at least, for those who are not real convinced, like, just to maybe look at it and maybe wonder if maybe it's not quite as, like you said, it's just becomes a, well, now we're right sort of thing, as opposed to now we do it in a totally Christian way. It's just we're the Christians, so we can do whatever we want. And if we think that all those things done to the Christians were travesties before, we have to say that it's not bad done to other people. So, like you mentioned, are you willing to go to a mosque and destroy their stuff? Because I think a lot of people are like, yeah, of course, we want to do this. Go over to that mosque and set it on fire. Well, I'm not going to do that. Yeah, because you don't believe that, right? Maybe when it's overseas, but that's what they did. So if you feel uncomfortable with that, you should feel uncomfortable with those changes. And it's tough to go back on that, but it can take years. But go back and look, and maybe that can be a starting point to be a little hesitant about what we're doing.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you dedicating an hour and a half of your time here and all the time you put into it beforehand. So thanks for being willing to do this.
Yeah, I've been wanting to be on since since before you started it. So I'm glad I was able to come on and talk with you.
Awesome.